It was supposed to be just another calm Saturday. Birds were chirping, sprinklers clicked on one by one along the neatly trimmed sidewalks, and the neighborhood group chat was relatively quiet for once. Then Karen clipped the wrong lock. Within 7 seconds of her cutting the steel cable on my Lamborghini and sliding into the driver's seat like she was starring in some budget Fast and Furious spin-off, a high-pitched drone siren erupted above her. She didn't know it yet, but she just activated the kind of federal protocol reserved for terrorist threats and embassy breaches. As her phone recorded a smug selfie video, the voice inside the Lambo calmly announced from the dashboard, "Unauthorized access detected, federal response deployed." She laughed. Then the back panel ejected a bright blue tracker, her seatbelt locked with a snap, and she was suddenly no longer in control of the car. And I was watching it all live from my living room with a cup of coffee and a federal response unit already en route. Karen thought she'd scored a petty neighborhood victory. She had no idea she just hijacked a Homeland Security operations vehicle in disguise. The neighborhood had always been a strange mix of tranquil and toxic. Everyone pretended to smile through their teeth, but drama simmered like a pot just one flick from boiling over. My house sat on the edge of the cul-de-sac, modern architecture, clean lines, 3 security cameras hidden in plain sight, and one very flashy Lamborghini Huracan usually tucked away in my garage unless I needed to run diagnostics. Karen lived 3 houses down, a woman who had turned HOA enforcement into a full-time job with the attitude of a mall cop on a power trip. She once wrote up my neighbor for having an inflatable dinosaur in their yard past holiday hours. The same woman once made a scene because someone had set their trash bin out 30 minutes early. Her greatest enemy was nonconformity, and her favorite target was me. From the moment I moved in, she had questions. What do you do? How can you afford that car? Why are there always trucks outside your house? Why is your internet satellite linked? I gave her the same answer every time. I work in IT. Technically true, just not in the way she thought. I wasn't going to explain that my Lambo was a Homeland Security rigged surveillance vehicle, customized for low-profile urban deployment with enough tech in its frame to make a spy agency jealous. It was on a cool-down rotation after a major operation and parked on my own driveway, locked, alarmed, and disguised beneath a heat-resistant cover. That morning, Karen had already made 2 rounds walking her yappy Pomeranian. She gave me the side eye as I brought the recycling bin back from the curb, her lips curled in judgment as always. I saw her glance at the Lambo, half-covered, clearly annoyed that something so bold existed in her otherwise colorless kingdom. I thought nothing of it. I should have. Because while I went inside and brewed coffee, she doubled back with bolt cutters. She must have thought she was doing some neighborhood justice, like she was the star of her own reality show. I still have the footage from my door cam and the drone's overhead view. Karen snuck onto my driveway, looked around like a cartoon burglar, and clipped the high-grade lock like it was a gym locker. She tore the cover off with dramatic flair and took a selfie with the Lambo like she'd won a game show prize. Then she opened the door and slid in. That's when the sensors woke up. The moment the ignition button was touched, the system recognized a non-biometric user. Instead of starting the engine, it booted into containment mode. Karen thought the car was stalling. Instead, it sent my phone a live video feed, pinged Homeland Security's satellite relay, and launched 2 perimeter drones to lock visual. The car door shut on its own and the seat adjusted automatically, restraining her in a perfect upright position. Onboard speakers chimed a calm but firm message. Attention unauthorized driver, this vehicle is protected by the United States Department of Homeland Security. Do not attempt to exit. At first, she laughed. You can hear it in the footage. A full Karen chuckle, like she thought the voice was a prank or some novelty alarm system. Then the car locked the steering wheel and pulsed the LED lights in warning. She stopped laughing. Her phone recording got shaky. She fumbled at the door handle but it wouldn't budge. The car had shifted into secure lockdown mode. Within 2 minutes, she was on the main street and panicking. My custom-coded defense protocol included non-lethal lockdown paired with high-visibility alert. Flashing strobe pulses in the taillights started blinking. Horn blasts mimicked a coded signal. And above her, the two drones circled like birds of prey. She tried to call someone, but the signal was rerouted to Homeland's auto-response bot. Then she tried screaming out the window, but they were sealed. I watched all this while still in my robe, sipping hot coffee. Meanwhile, I received a call from Agent Reyes. His voice was calm, almost amused. He asked the usual verification phrase. I gave the correct code and said casually, "Yeah, Karen finally did it." Reyes chuckled and replied, "We've got eyes on her vehicle now. Sending a mobile unit. You want us to intercept at the intersection or let her stew?" I told him let her stew just long enough to regret every decision that led to this moment. Back on the street, people were starting to notice. A few neighbors stepped out, confused. Karen's car was blinking like a rave and moving 5 miles an hour in self-driving mode toward the cul-de-sac exit. A swarm of birds flapped away as the drones descended lower. When she screamed out for help, a kid on a bike actually waved at her like it was some TikTok stunt. She started yelling about being kidnapped by robots. My security system captured every moment. The street camera feed. Her original trespass. The ignition failure. Her shrieking at the top of her lungs about HOA regulations. It was pure comedy, if not for the serious implications. Homeland Protocol doesn't take breaches lightly, no matter how petty. Once a lockdown is triggered, everything becomes part of a federal log. Karen had crossed from nosy neighbor into data breach territory. And she had no clue. By the time Agent Reyes's black SUV pulled up at the intersection, Karen was crying. Red-faced, furious, her hair a mess, trying to kick the dashboard like it would make a difference. Reyes approached calmly, badge out, followed by 2 uniformed agents. She screamed something about citizens' rights and HOA permissions. Then the door finally unlocked, and she was greeted by a silence heavier than any shout. She was escorted out, not handcuffed, but certainly not free to leave. Her husband showed up a few minutes later, jogging in flip-flops and a bathrobe, completely clueless. The agents waved him aside. One of the drones hovered beside the Lambo, recording the entire debrief. Reyes looked at me across the lawn and gave a subtle nod. I raised my mug in return. Karen stood in the middle of the street, humiliated, trying to argue her way out of federal detention like it was a parking ticket. Neighbors filmed quietly. The HOA president peeked out of her blinds. And the Lambo? It was towed back onto my driveway and parked perfectly by the AI system it housed. The morning after the incident, the entire neighborhood felt like it had been dunked in cold water. No one said it outright, but every person who glanced my way did so with the kind of stiff, hesitant nod usually reserved for people who had just returned from war or federal trials. Word had traveled fast, faster than I expected, even with Karen's livestream having been picked up and clipped into a dozen viral TikToks overnight. Headlines weren't helping either. Entitled woman tries to steal car turns out to be Homeland Security trap was now plastered across every corner of the internet. But the real storm hadn't even begun. By mid-morning, a white unmarked van rolled up to Karen's driveway. It didn't take a genius to know it was federal. Clean, no decals, but 3 guys in civilian clothes stepped out in perfect sync, their movements almost too coordinated to be casual. The one in the lead had the posture of someone who had spent time briefing senators. Karen's front door creaked open slowly like even the house was embarrassed. She appeared in a half-zipped tracksuit, trying to smile, as if she could casually spin federal questioning into some misunderstanding. I watched from my home office, camera feed rolling on one screen while my laptop displayed an incoming call from Agent Reyes. He didn't waste time. He simply said Karen's triggered secondary protocols. "We need your clearance for data release." I nodded and authenticated the release token, allowing them to access the Lambo's internal logs from the incident. The video, audio, telemetry, all of it. They would match her fingerprints, voice ID, gait patterns, and determine what classified sequences, if any, she had unintentionally activated. To her credit, Karen tried. She actually attempted to tell the agents she thought the car was abandoned and dangerous, and she was simply moving it for safety. That argument fell apart quickly once she was asked how bolt cutters factored into her safety plan. Then they showed her the drone footage. She visibly froze, lips moving without sound, face twitching through 7 stages of panic. Her husband stood nearby holding a garden hose like it might somehow help. Meanwhile, the HOA chat group was a battlefield. Some were demanding Karen's resignation from the board. Others, clearly still loyal to her strange suburban reign, tried defending her. One neighbor asked if this meant Homeland Security was secretly watching them all. Another replied with a gif of popcorn and wrote, "Probably just Karen. I wasn't part of the chat, but a friend next door was feeding me the play-by-play." Within the hour, the agents escorted Karen to their vehicle. Not in cuffs, but not entirely free either. The term used was voluntary cooperation under federal advisement, which in Karen's mind probably translated to she was invited to help clear things up. She waved awkwardly to some onlookers, trying to act like this was all procedural. A drone followed overhead, whirring quietly like a hawk. Once she was gone, Agent Reyes showed up at my place. He let himself in like usual, flashing his ID at the Ring camera as if that still meant something after yesterday's spectacle. I met him in the kitchen and handed him a cup of coffee before we sat at the counter reviewing files. He slid a folder across the table. "You might want to read the HOA's formal response," he said. I opened it. Inside was a 3-paragraph letter from the board. It apologized for the unfortunate misunderstanding involving a member acting independently and reassured that the HOA respects all federal and local authorities. I almost laughed. Karen had basically acted like a rogue agent of chaos, and now they were pretending she was some random rogue raccoon they'd never met. I slid the paper back. "This'll look good in court." Reyes grinned. That evening, everything went nuclear. A local news van parked 2 blocks away and began broadcasting live. Someone had leaked footage of Karen being approached by agents. No surprise there, it was already circulating online. But what made it worse was the uncut livestream Karen had filmed from inside the Lambo. It had captured her mocking the car's voice warnings, trying to take selfies mid-panic, and saying out loud, "I bet this loser doesn't even know I took it yet." The internet responded predictably. Memes exploded. Comments ranged from people roasting her entitlement to conspiracy theorists asking if all Lambos were secretly government vehicles. Homeland even had to issue a brief statement confirming that certain custom vehicles were occasionally deployed in field operations and remain property of the agency when off-duty. They didn't name her. But they didn't have to. I thought the chaos might settle there. But then Karen's husband did something that made it worse. He went on the news. Holding a printed HOA handbook, he claimed the entire thing was blown out of proportion, that his wife believed the vehicle was part of a neighborhood threat, and that she had previously reported suspicious activities at my address. When asked what those suspicious activities were, he said I had unusual garage equipment and weird antennas. The anchor paused before asking if he knew I worked with the federal government. His face twisted slightly. "That's classified," he replied. Which, of course, made it even more ridiculous. The clip aired nationally. Within hours, it was on morning radio shows, trending on Twitter, and my front yard was swarming with curious onlookers. The icing on the cake came late that night. A new drone arrived. Not part of my setup, but a federal model dispatched from HQ. It landed silently on my roof and deployed a wide-angle panoramic scan of the neighborhood. Reyes texted me simply saying additional surveillance temporary. Not for you. It was clear now. Homeland had escalated the event from isolated incident to potential exposure. Not because Karen was a threat, but because she had unintentionally triggered a visible weakness in the agency's low-profile asset placement system. If someone like her could walk up and access a field-ready vehicle, even partially, what would a real infiltrator be capable of? That's when things shifted. I wasn't just a homeowner with a tech background anymore. I became a variable in a national security equation. And Karen? She became a perfect case study in how ignorance and entitlement can cause a federal chain reaction. The neighborhood began to divide. Half the residents were furious at the unwanted attention, blaming Karen. The other half were gossiping like it was the best drama to hit their street in years. The HOA board sent out a letter postponing all community events until further notice, and formally announced an emergency meeting to address public conduct violations. 3 days passed, but the shockwave Karen had unleashed kept spreading like ripples in a storm-fed lake. At first, I thought the worst was behind us. She had been publicly humiliated, federal authorities had gotten involved, and the neighborhood's illusion of peace had cracked wide open. But it was only now that the deeper consequences began to surface. What Karen and most of the neighborhood didn't understand was that my car wasn't just a flashy machine with hidden gadgets. It was part of a broader, classified initiative codenamed Operation Falcon Echo, and she had accidentally made herself part of the operational record. That's when things got truly complicated. Not just for her, but for me too. The origins of that car stretched back to a time most people assumed I was simply working remote tech jobs. The truth was that after a few years in private cybersecurity, I was quietly recruited by Homeland's Adaptive Field Response Division. They were building a series of mobile surveillance assets that looked like high-end civilian vehicles but operated with classified hardware, encrypted uplinks, and AI-driven threat diagnostic. These cars were not only tools. They were decoys, meant to lure and track espionage activity in places no one would expect, including clean-cut suburbs like this one. My Lambo had gone through 8 countries before it ever rolled into my driveway. It had been part of 2 silent busts, and at least 1 successful deflection of a serious cyber attack plot involving foreign agents. Karen had treated it like a status symbol. In reality, it had more built-in countermeasures than the local police department had in their entire fleet. So when Reyes returned to my home for a follow-up meeting, this time with 2 analysts from the operations division, the tone had changed. They weren't smiling. They weren't drinking coffee. They laid out files, reports, timestamps, footage, and satellite imagery. Every step Karen had taken, every angle of her face, every word she had muttered in the car, all of it had been digitally isolated, voice printed, and cross-checked against federal records. They weren't looking to punish her. They were looking to assess risk. Was she just some entitled woman who got too nosy for her own good, or was there something more beneath the surface? I vouched for her. I told them she was just what she appeared to be. Self-important, careless, nosy to the point of absurdity, but not dangerous. They didn't argue. But they made one thing clear. Because of the breach, I was now personally responsible for any residual fallout in the neighborhood. The car would remain under lockdown and would be extracted for reinstallation. Until then, I was to maintain complete control of all footage and ensure that no residual data leaked out. Not to the press. Not to curious neighbors. Not even as jokes. What made this more surreal was how completely Karen misunderstood the entire situation. After getting temporarily released from questioning, she returned to the neighborhood acting like she had narrowly escaped injustice. She even held a backyard support gathering, inviting only people she considered real neighbors, and telling them her version of events. According to her, the government had overreacted. She was trying to protect the community. The car had no license plate visible and therefore must have been suspicious. She even suggested that I might be using the car to spy on her. Her husband nodded along the entire time, clutching a glass of cheap wine like it was a lifeline. Unfortunately for her, not everyone was buying it. The same neighbors who used to be afraid of her now felt betrayed. She had always positioned herself as the moral compass of the HOA, but now she looked like a fool who nearly brought a federal lawsuit to their doorstep. One resident openly called her out during her little party, asking how bolt cutters fit into her story. Karen smiled thinly and said she had them on hand for emergencies. The man rolled his eyes and left. The deeper irony was that while Karen spun her version of events, she had no idea that her entire history with me had already been reviewed in depth. Homeland had access to my footage archive going back months. They saw how she had trespassed twice before under the guise of measuring property lines. They watched her peering through my windows with binoculars. They even noted how she photographed my mail once. She wasn't just nosy. She was borderline obsessive. The analysts suggested she may have been trying to build a case against me, possibly for the HOA. She had even filed 2 complaints about me having what she described as suspicious antennas and unlicensed satellite dishes. These were high-frequency receivers, well within regulation, and legally protected under my security clearance. She just didn't know that. One of the most bizarre discoveries was an old HOA complaint Karen had filed about a year ago. She accused me of harboring illegally modified equipment and demanded a community audit. Her request was rejected without ceremony, but it made it clear she had been targeting me long before the Lambo ever showed up. Her obsession wasn't new. This incident was simply the explosion point. The analysts called it patterned escalation, textbook behavior for someone who believes they are losing control of their environment. And Karen, for all her outward control, was panicking internally the moment she realized she wasn't in charge. The fallout continued. Homeland issued a formal document to the local authorities explaining the nature of the vehicle, the breach, and the community's new status as a monitored site. Though no names were listed publicly, anyone paying attention knew it was about our neighborhood. Local news showed blurred images of the car, mentioning the odd Homeland vehicle now subject of security review. Karen saw the report and, shockingly, doubled down. She called into a local radio station claiming she was being harassed, that someone had planted a government car near her home to intimidate her. Her voice was shaking, but her words were aggressive. She said the truth would come out, that the neighborhood needed to be protected from surveillance. The host didn't even take her seriously, cutting her off mid-rant and playing music over her. But the damage was done. Again. The next morning, I walked outside to check my mailbox and found a crumpled pamphlet on my lawn. It was homemade, titled Neighborhood Watch Against Unauthorized Surveillance. On the back was a phone number with a hand-scrawled note that said call to report suspicious antennas. I laughed out loud. Karen had officially gone rogue. Not only was she spinning conspiracy theories, she was starting her own resistance group. Against me. Against Homeland. Against a car she thought she could commandeer like it was her right. I didn't report the pamphlet. I didn't need to. One of the federal analysts was still living temporarily on the same block under light cover, and I knew he'd already picked one up. Reyes confirmed it an hour later with a simple text. Got it. She's making this easier. I had a strange sense of calm. The kind of calm you only feel when you know something big is brewing, but you're not the one who's going to suffer for it. Karen had crossed lines she didn't even understand existed. She had treated a federal operation like a personal HOA vendetta. And now, while she paced inside her house writing up fake newsletters and planning her next paranoid backyard meeting, she had no idea that her name was still circulating in Homeland's internal memos. The fourth day after the incident began just as strangely as the others had ended, with confusion in the air and tension under every neighbor's polite smile. The neighborhood no longer felt like the peaceful, HOA-regulated haven it once pretended to be. It now felt like a suburban version of a military base, except instead of soldiers we had gossiping retirees and curious teenagers peeking out of windows. The real shift came that morning when the HOA president sent out an emergency email calling for a community-wide meeting to discuss neighborhood concerns. It didn't mention Karen by name, but everyone knew. You didn't need a decoder ring to figure it out. I watched from my porch as neighbors walked by, pretending not to glance at my house. The Lambo was gone now, taken by the Homeland extraction team overnight and loaded onto an enclosed trailer bound for reprogramming and deeper forensic analysis. They didn't even leave tire tracks. It was as if it had never been there. But the absence was louder than its presence. Its disappearance said something final to the neighborhood. This wasn't just a flashy car being towed. This was the government removing an asset. Karen, however, didn't seem to grasp the finality of anything. Around noon, she emerged in full form again, strutting to the community park with her little clipboard and a fake smile stretched across her face. She wore oversized sunglasses and a sun hat like she was shielding herself from paparazzi. She greeted everyone loudly, as if the last 4 days hadn't happened, as if the news vans, the federal questioning, and the public humiliation hadn't left a permanent mark. But people didn't respond the way they used to. Her usual minions were nowhere to be found. A few politely nodded and quickly walked away. The woman who used to control the tone of the neighborhood now walked among people who barely made eye contact. I received another call from Reyes that afternoon. His tone was different this time, firmer. He told me they had completed a full review of Karen's online activity and flagged several patterns that required further legal attention. She had begun spreading misinformation about the agency, accusing federal agents of illegal surveillance, and had even posted in 3 different community forums that I was some kind of embedded intelligence officer spying on civilians. He said the agency wasn't going to pursue defamation. It wasn't worth it. But the FBI had taken notice of one thing she'd said during her livestream and later doubled down on during her radio call-in, that she knew about the car's real function before taking it. That changed everything. That single claim suggested intent. If she had suspected it was federal property and still tried to move it or tamper with it, that wasn't ignorance anymore. That could be interpreted as willful interference with a federal asset. I asked Reyes if they were really going to press charges. He didn't confirm or deny. He only said that the legal review had been escalated. She wasn't being looked at as a nosy neighbor anymore. She was now being looked at as someone who potentially obstructed an active intelligence operation. Later that evening, the emergency HOA meeting was held in the community clubhouse. The tension was electric. Everyone showed up. The seats were full. Some stood against the walls. Karen, dressed in her usual pastel power outfit, took a seat in the front row like she owned the place. The HOA board looked tired. Their smiles were forced. They opened the meeting with vague statements about unity and the need to move forward together. But then a younger resident stood up and asked directly why someone who triggered a federal investigation was still on the HOA board. There was a pause, followed by murmurs, and then another resident echoed the question. Karen stood and interrupted, insisting that everything had been blown out of proportion, that she had been misled, and that she had only acted out of concern. She said the government overreacted. She even threw in some bizarre conspiracy comments about federal vehicles being planted to monitor HOA elections. Some people snickered. A few looked concerned. But no one agreed with her. Then a retired Navy officer from down the street stood and calmly stated that Karen had not only trespassed and committed property damage, but had put the entire community at risk by interfering with federal operations. He reminded everyone that even civilians have responsibilities, that recklessness can have consequences even if it starts with curiosity. That moment broke whatever illusion Karen had left. Her eyes darted around the room. Her husband, seated in the back, looked away and stared at the floor. No one defended her. Not a single person. The HOA president finally cleared her throat and stated that due to recent events, the board would be voting to suspend Karen's seat, pending further investigation. There was no argument. She sat down slowly, face frozen, lips trembling slightly. I didn't speak at the meeting. I didn't need to. The room had spoken for me. The following morning, things got stranger. A legal notice was taped to Karen's front door. She tore it down before anyone else could read it, but the rumor mill churned quickly. Someone had heard it was a cease and desist from the Department of Justice, warning her to stop spreading classified details online. Others said it was a civil notice informing her of potential liability. I didn't know which version was true, but I did know that Reyes called me shortly after and said simply the situation is transitioning. She'll be receiving a formal visit soon. That same day, security footage from my rooftop system, previously classified and now partially redacted, was quietly cleared for limited public release. Homeland had decided to let it go viral in a controlled way to squash misinformation. The footage showed Karen cutting the lock, ripping the cover, sitting inside the vehicle, and activating the protocol. The moment the Lambo announced federal ownership was crystal clear. The internet went wild again. The clips went viral under new titles like Karen steals government spy car and woman triggers drone response thinking she's entitled to Lamborghini. The public sentiment was overwhelmingly brutal. Memes flooded every corner of the internet. People started calling her Spy Hunter Karen. A parody video even recreated the scene using action figures. Meanwhile, Karen locked herself inside her house and didn't come out for 2 days. I used that time to clean up. I reviewed my own systems, updated firewalls, removed backdoors from local servers, and finalized a report Homeland had asked for regarding the efficiency of the Lambo's AI threat protocol. The incident, as embarrassing as it had been on the surface, had actually proven the effectiveness of the tech. Civilian interference had triggered the system, but it had responded exactly as designed. Containment, live feed, non-lethal lockout, and facial recognition all operated within safety margins. From a performance perspective, the incident was a win. And yet, something still didn't sit right. Because Karen had crossed a line none of us ever imagined she would. And even after being humiliated, suspended, investigated, and publicly disgraced, there was still a feeling in the air that she wasn't done. That somewhere inside that house, she was planning something. The next morning arrived wrapped in silence, but it didn't feel like peace. It felt like the tension that comes just before lightning strikes. Reyes showed up early, just after sunrise, stepping out of a black sedan that didn't belong to him. The man who followed behind him was unfamiliar, tall, sharp-suited, and carrying a narrow briefcase with a dull silver latch. They didn't greet me at the door. They simply entered the gate after a quick scan, nodded once, and made their way into my kitchen as if it were their office. I closed the door behind them without a word. I could already tell this wasn't a casual update. This was about to be something final. Reyes placed a tablet on the counter and spun it toward me. The screen showed a series of emails. They were all written by Karen, sent to various local media outlets, bloggers, and one anti-surveillance conspiracy site. She had been feeding them a narrative that tied me to a federal surveillance ring targeting civilians, implying Homeland Security had planted me in the neighborhood to monitor citizens' behaviors. She mentioned fabricated files, claimed to have photographic evidence, and cited obscure government regulations like she had just discovered a secret nobody else had. I stared at the screen for a long time. It wasn't just paranoid rambling anymore. She had crossed into dangerous territory, trying to build a narrative that would draw the attention of people who thrived on misinformation and outrage. The man in the suit introduced himself as Agent Mark. He explained that while Homeland had no intention of engaging in a public spectacle, the DOJ had determined that Karen's campaign now posed reputational risk and potential national security concern. It wasn't about me anymore. It was about what she could trigger if someone believed her story and acted on it. It only takes one unhinged person, Mark said quietly, to show up with bad intentions because they think they're stopping some imaginary threat. They laid out their plan. No arrest. No public confrontation. Just precision. A legal suit was already being filed. Civil, not criminal, under a rarely used federal clause for reckless civilian interference with secure operations. Karen would be served quietly. A formal notice would go out to her legal counsel. The footage and communication logs would be sealed, but the viral clips had done enough damage. Her credibility was gone. She was being given one final chance to walk away quietly. If she didn't, then the criminal charges would follow. Reyes stood and said something I didn't expect. "You were too kind. Most people would have pressed charges on day one." I didn't respond. Maybe I was too kind. Maybe I had hoped she'd humiliate herself so completely that she'd just retreat and stay gone. I had underestimated her capacity to spiral. The agents left without fanfare. Just like that, it was over. Or so I thought. That weekend, the neighborhood was uncharacteristically still. No joggers. No dog walkers. No HOA clipboard patrols. Karen's house remained quiet. Her car hadn't moved in days. Curtains were drawn. Rumors swirled about what had happened. Some said she'd left town. Others claimed she was plotting a countersuit. I didn't care anymore. I had submitted my final report. The car was gone. Homeland had pulled surveillance off the street, and I was preparing to rotate to my next assignment. But there was one last thing I wanted to do before leaving. I had been quietly buying property on the edge of the community for months. Most people assumed it was for storage or expansion. What they didn't know was that the plot included the office building the HOA leased for their operations. The owner, a private real estate group, had no issue selling. The board had been behind on payments anyway, thanks to all the legal chaos Karen caused. I bought it under a shell corporation through a separate trust. The paperwork was done in under a week. No one saw it coming. That Monday, I walked into the HOA office with a simple letter and a box. The president, visibly shaken by the weeks of madness, was behind the desk. I placed the envelope in front of her. She opened it slowly, eyes widening as she read the notice. Effective immediately, the HOA had 90 days to vacate or renegotiate under new ownership. Her face turned pale. She asked who the owner was. I gave her the name of the trust. Then I pushed the box forward. Inside was a stack of Karen's fake newsletters, a flash drive containing video footage, and a printout of her emails to the media. I told her this was everything I had kept quiet about, that I had no interest in destroying the community. But if Karen tried anything else, I would release the full report, and this time, I wouldn't blur names. I left her office without another word. A week later, the HOA board held an emergency vote and removed Karen permanently from all positions. Her privileges were revoked, her access to documents suspended, and her name scrubbed from upcoming ballots. She never showed up to fight it. Not even once. She vanished from public view like someone finally realizing they were no longer the main character in the story. To mark the end of the saga, I hosted a barbecue at the park, open to everyone. No HOA agenda. No rules. Just food, music, and a big sign that read open to all neighbors except one. People laughed. They brought lawn chairs and kids. Music played from speakers set up near the community fountain. Someone even brought a cake shaped like a Lamborghini. It was lighthearted. Finally, for the first time in weeks, the community felt like it had exhaled. Midway through the event, a sleek black vehicle rolled up quietly to the curb. It was the Lambo, back from the lab. But it had changed. The paint job was updated. The rims were different. New tags. But most importantly, it now had a decal on the passenger door that read Demonstration Unit Inactive in small block letters. It wasn't functional anymore, but it was still mine. The kids ran to take photos with it. Adults posed next to it jokingly. One neighbor laughed and asked if it still had lasers. I smiled and told him no. Just fireworks now. Across the street, I saw Karen standing behind her curtain. She thought no one could see her. But the light hit her window just right. And there she was, watching a party she wasn't invited to. Watching the car she had tried to steal. Watching a neighborhood that had moved on without her. The curtain twitched, then fell still. As the sun set, people packed up their chairs and kids, said their goodbyes, and returned to their homes. I stood next to the car, arms folded, taking in the silence. Then my phone buzzed. A final message from Reyes. It read simply, "She's officially flagged, no longer your problem." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. The message said everything. I stepped into the car and closed the door. The engine started with a soft hum, but I didn't drive. I just sat there for a while, staring through the windshield at a neighborhood that had finally found its balance again. Karen may have thought she could break locks and boundaries and rules, but she never realized that some locks aren't just metal and chains. Some locks are built from layers of protocol, law, and consequences, and when you cut through those, you don't just open a door. You open something that never closes again.